Dr. Stephen Murphy, welcome to the Lives of the Artists. It's fantastic to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So, to the audience, how do we approach the idea of art in Buddhist art in the Buddhist world? How do we approach that to someone that might not know much about that world?
Yes, that is probably the most important way of framing this discussion, I would imagine. Art in the Buddhist world, if you think of it compared to maybe Western art, first of all, it's the reason for it can be quite different. It's art, obviously, like any religious art, it's there for devotional purposes first. It's not really art for art's sake. And if you start to understand how Buddhism functions, then you can start to get a window into why these types of art forms are being created, what types of mediums they're using, how they act in terms of worship or in terms of some key Buddhist concepts such as karma, which I think everybody would be familiar with, which is the gaining of good merit so that you're reborn into a better life. So really to sort of try and get a handle on it, you have to really try and think of it from a Buddhist perspective, if that's possible. So that's maybe something we can start to unpack or get into
for sure.
today.
So when was the first sort of image of the Buddha created? Does anyone have an idea of when that came about, and whereabouts in the world was that?
Right. So what's interesting about Buddhism is that for the first 200 or 300 years after of its existence as a religion, it's what we would sometimes refer to as aniconic. So the Buddha as a person is not shown in human form; he's shown in symbolic form. So
for the first 200
for
years.
about the first 200 to 300 years.
And so this is when?
So there's debate over it. Originally, scholars thought that the Buddha was born in the 6th century BCE or BC. So that's 2,600 years ago. We're very sure about his birthplace, which is called Lumpini. It's in modern-day Nepal, but it's right on the Nepalese-Indian border.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where he's from. During his lifetime, if the Buddhist texts say that he lived to about 80 years old, so within this span of 80 years, he moved around that region of southern Nepal and northern India. So that's the key location for the Buddha. But during his lifetime...
And was it a sort of a development of Hinduism, or was it something independent?
No, and even at this point, you don't have Hinduism in a form that you'd recognize today.
Mm-hmm.
So at this moment, you have similar religious concepts and beliefs within the area which is now India and Nepal, and Hinduism, of course, is developing at that time as well. But what's happening is these religions are actually developing concurrently.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, they all share the belief in rebirth. So this is one of the key tenets of Buddhism and Hinduism, for that matter. Where they differ is then what you do about it, and how do you. For Buddhism, it's all about breaking the cycle of rebirth. You don't actually, unlike Judeo-Christian religions, you don't actually want to get to heaven. You want to just cease to be, so non-existence, which is the meaning of nirvana. So this is how Buddhism starts. Now we're pretty sure actually that it happens at the Buddha is born about 400 BCE. There's been a revision of the dating, but so you have this period where after this, the Buddhist teachings start to circulate, and it's not until about maybe the 2nd century CE that you start to get actual images of the Buddha. So it's quite a long stretch.
And so why do you think that was?
The texts do say, the Buddha does say, "Do not depict me." It's also important to remember that the Buddha is not a god, right? He's a person that reached enlightenment, and then once he passed away, entered into nirvana. So the idea is, even today, you may see, or you will see, Buddhist devotees giving offerings in front of a Buddha image, praying in front of a Buddha image, but they're not praying to the Buddha image in the same way that, say, a Catholic would pray to the Virgin Mary or to Christ, Jesus Christ, as in they think that there's some sort of power that these, praying to a natural God that can then make something happen in this world. In the Buddhist belief, the Buddha is the image of the Buddha is just a substitute for the actual historical Buddha himself. Definitely in this sort of Southeast Asian traditions, or what we call Theravada. So yeah, there's a slight difference there as well in terms of that. So that's one reason why we think that originally there was no Buddha images created, because you weren't actually meant to pray to the Buddha.
Right.
But at the same time, like every religion, you need ways of commemorating or symbolizing the founding figure of your religion. So in Buddhism, they did this in a few ways. One was through a number of symbols, such as the Bodhi tree. So this is the tree under which the Buddha reached enlightenment. So you would see a Bodhi tree carved in stone. That would be enough of a recognition for a Buddhist believer to know that stands for the Buddha.
So those were early symbols.
These are early symbols. There's another.
And how would they be depicted? They'd be carved into stone?
Carved into stone, usually on large-scale monuments that we call stupa. So sometimes in Western parlance, they got called pagodas, which is a term that I think comes into use in the sort of 16th, 17th century. But technically, we would more refer to them as a stupa, which is a reliquary monument. So they're burial mounds, and after the Buddha was passed away, he was cremated, and then his bones were divided up between 8 different kings, and these were then put in these 8 different monuments or stupas and enclosed within them. And then this tradition continues and expands throughout the Buddhist world. So so I suppose it's not. The stupa as well is again, this aniconic or symbolic representation of the Buddha. So particularly in somewhere like Myanmar, the stupa can actually act in the same way as a Buddha image, that people will go and they will make offerings and devotions to the stupa, and then they will, what we say, circumambulate around it in a clockwise fashion. So again, there's even once you get the Buddha depicted in human form or anthropomorphic form, these other aniconic traditions still continue side by side. So you have both a sort of symbolic representation and then usually an idealized representation of the Buddha.
So these early symbolic representations of Buddha weren't the image of Buddha, but they were, like you say, the Bodhi tree and things that symbolized him that people would pray to. And then how did it develop? How did the early artwork develop into images of the Buddha?
Yeah, that's one of the major questions and contentions, I suppose, in our field of scholarship. The earliest images we start to get are in a period called Gandhara, which is modern day Afghanistan, Pakistan. Your viewers or your listeners are probably most familiar with the Bamiyan Buddha. And
the one that was destroyed
blown up by the Taliban. So it's that region where you first get the depiction of the Buddha in human form.
Wow.
This is also a region that Alexander the Great conquered in 320 BC, in this type of period, and brought in Hellenistic art, so Greco-Roman forms. Right. So you already had a sculptural tradition there coming in from the Greco-Roman world. Okay. And then we think it merges with a North Indian, Nepalese Buddhist tradition, and you start to get the Buddha represented in
absolutely
human form.
Fascinating. So this is it moved from northern India. I'm trying to understand geographically, and it's gone northwest into Afghanistan. Yeah. And they've started creating images of the Buddha. Did anything go east as well?
Yes. Or it basically spreads out. It goes northwest up into Gandhara. It goes south into southern India, into Sri Lanka. And then it goes southeast into Southeast Asia. Right. And then it goes east along the Silk Roads into Central Asia. So areas like which would now be Tajikistan,
Uzbekistan, yeah.
That's 5 stands. And then, of course, into China, and then from China into Korea and Japan.
Right.
So
amazing.
that's the spread.
So, but the early images of the Buddha that were created were in this region of Afghanistan.
That's right, as far as we know, and also an area called Kushan in India, which, to orientate your reader or your listener, is very close. It's in a town called Mathura, which is very close to Agra, which is where the Taj Mahal is. Mm-hmm. So it's in that type of area that we're starting to see the development. We have human, or what we call anthropomorphic depictions. Mm. So gods are people in human form, and the Hindu tradition has that from early on. So you're getting the Hindu tradition depicting its gods like Shiva, Vishnu, particularly these snake deities called Nagas. You're getting that happening as well, sort of earlier. So again, the difficult thing to unpick is how much of it is influence from the Greco-Roman world with the Hellenistic art, and how much of it is developing, say, in areas like Kushan, in the Hindu tradition, and then sort of Buddhism taking these traditions and making something of its own from them. So
what I mean. It's obviously it's complex and it's sort of lost in the midst of time. But that's what I'm trying to sort of understand, is why in this region of the world firstly, why did they depict the Buddha? What was the depiction that they thought was the Buddha?
Right. So what's interesting is that the earliest depictions of the Buddha in the Gandharan period are very naturalistic, and his facial features look quite Afghani. So like most artists anywhere in the world, they will use the people around them as their models, right? So there's lots of Christian examples of, Jesus Christ looking like a 15th century Italian, right? When he's actually from, the Middle East or from the Levant. So you get a similar phenomenon in Buddhism, where actually the Buddha usually takes on very localized characteristics as the religion spreads. But so at first you see him very sort of Afghani. He's got sometimes a nice sort of mustache, and he's got a top knot as well.
Oh wow!
And the robes that they wear are very similar to the draped, transparent robes that you see in the Hellenistic world as well. So you get this very clear crossover. Quite quickly, though, you see the Buddha image transform from a naturalistic human form into a more idealized sort of supernatural form.
And what were those images?
And so that starts quite quickly, even within the Gandhara region, but definitely by the sort of 3rd, 4th century CE or AD in Western sense. In the area called, again in northern India, and this time we have a kingdom called the Gupta kingdom, or the Gupta period, which again the emperors were great supporters of Buddhism. You start to see the Buddha take on maybe the forms that your viewers are more familiar with today, where he has 32 auspicious marks or characteristics. One of them is that his hair looks like, they say, like snail shells. So he gets this very curly hair, and then he has this bump on his head, ushnisha, and that actually develops out of the top knot, and it becomes this sort of cranial bump, and that's to show
those sculptures you see a lot in Southeast Asia and Thailand and places like that.
They all have it, and then some will have the flame coming out on top as well. So this cranial bump or ushnisha is to show his sort of superhuman intelligence, that he's enlightened, and then the flame is the sort of enlightened brightness of his knowledge. There's other things that you see. All of his fingers are the same length. His thighs are meant to look like banyan tree trunks. So you get a codification of how a Buddha image looks. So that becomes pretty standard. The other thing you'll also see is that he's never adorned with any jewelry, because if you know about the Buddha's life story, he's born a prince, but in order to reach enlightenment, he renunciates or renounces all of his material and earthly goods. So he's always depicted by and large, there is some exceptions, but by and large, he's always depicted just with a plain robe, like a monk would wear today, and no adornment. So that's another way you can identify them. Then there's a number of postures they'll be in, like meditation posture. They'll sometimes be in a seated posture. There's a number of hand gestures that mean different things. So so it gets quite codified, and then this moves across the Buddhist world. We do have to be careful of, because there's a lot of regional adaptation, so it's not always.
Yeah, I imagine every region is sort of adapting,
sure.
their local ideas into this
exactly.
this new philosophy that was I guess was it moving with trade routes? Or?
Yeah, so it's moving definitely with trade.
It's not moving with conquest.
No. Definitely not.
Buddhism moves as an idea.
Yeah, Buddhism moves primarily with trade. It is a missionary religion in that sense, that it does go out and proselytize and try to convert, but maybe in not a sort of direct way. Say, for example, like Christianity or Islam, where you either have the Crusades or in the sort of colonial period, where you have this quite sort of brutal colonization and Christianity going hand in hand. We never see that with Buddhism.
Well, that's an incredible phenomenon, because it's traveled huge, massive area of the world with a massive population without any conquest.
Yeah, by and large, we can say that it offers certain things to the populaces that encounter it. It offers a way to quite a very systematic and logical way to how do I say it? To overcome suffering, to overcome death, to reach enlightenment. It also brings with it certain philosophical sort of ideas like karma and merit. It brings writing systems as well. So you got to think that religions are, for their day, they're very technologically advanced, so they bring these type of things. There's also another concept called a Dhammaraja. So Dhamma is the law or the teaching of the Buddha, and then a Raja is a king, so in Sanskrit. So a king who rules in accordance with the Buddhist law. So this is an idea that develops very early on in India and spreads out into the Buddhist world. So there is a bit of sort of politicking by Buddhists who can give this legitimacy to a king.
Right.
That if you sort of support Buddhism, support us, we in turn will recognize you as this Dhammaraja, this great king who rules with Buddhist tenets or principles.
As we later see in the Christian world,
Yeah, so it's very similar.
Kings.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a similar thing, and even today, the present king of Thailand is still seen as a Dhammaraja, and this monarch who rules in accordance with Buddhist principles. So this concept, survives all the way up until today. And again, I think it's one reason where Buddhism is they're quite savvy in that sense. The Buddhist monks, they know that they need sponsorship and patronage from monarchs or aristocrats or a lot of merchants as well. So it's not just the sort of royal echelons, it's also the merchants. And again, a lot of Buddhism moves by sea as well, particularly into Southeast Asia. So there's certain Buddhist deities that become protectors of seafarers and so on and so forth. So again, there's a lot of sort of incentive for people to become Buddhist in that sense.
And if we get back to these huge sculptures that were carved out of the mountain face or the rock face in Afghanistan, was that particular one, was that unique, or were there many of those made?
It's one of the largest. They're not unique. And again, if you think of the location, it's on this key trade route. So that's one of these key trade routes on the Overland Silk Road. So we know during that period that this was a thriving, multi sort of cosmopolitan region. To have them on that scale that early, I think they date from something like the 3rd or 4th century CE, but I'd have to double check it. But yeah, they're for that period, they're probably one of the largest. You do start to get similar scale rock cut Buddhas in China in about the 5th and 6th century. There's a few famous sites. One's Loyang, but there's more, and definitely by the sort of 10th century.
I always compare it back because my area of knowledge is obviously European art, but I'm fascinated in Eastern art and Asian art. But there's nothing on that scale in Europe.
No, and it's
at that time.
Also in one of the most spectacular sites, or Buddhist sites, is in India. It's called Ajanta Caves. And this is a huge cave complex where they have carved out into the rock, basically temples into the rock face. So they're like cave temples, and you go in and they're completely decorated in Buddhist art, stupas in the center, Buddha images. And I'm trying to remember how many caves there are. It's, over 50 or 100 caves. And this site was occupied for at least 300 or 400 years. So again, you see this amazing traditions of rock carving, stone carving that, in Europe at the time, it's the so-called Dark Ages, right? We're kind of running around in the muck, running away from Vikings or something like that. Whereas,
there's nothing on that scale. There's nothing
scale.
Sort of going on like that. So you wonder why. Why and how would it have been really these trade routes that brought this wealth and brought this engineering and brought these ideas?
Yeah. So it is quite remarkable, and you get Hinduism as well at the same time. So they're definitely they're sort of riffing off each other, and you get, it's pretty clear sometimes that the tradesmen or the artisans are making both the Hindu and the Buddhist temples. So there's no sort of
that's really interesting.
There's no doctrinal. It's not like Catholics and Protestants. I mean, at certain points, there's certain flashpoints in the history of India where, yes, there is iconoclasm between Hinduism and Buddhism, but in general, and particularly in Southeast Asia, they coexist quite happily. But we see examples of that as well, where the sort of craftsmen are moving between both. Probably.
So this was really these areas, the Silk Road and areas like this where Buddhism spread in this area of Asia was really like the center of the world at the time.
Yeah.
If you go there now, a lot of these towns are quite deserted. Then the world has changed, but at that time, it must have seemed like the center of the world.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it depends where you're standing, right? I mean, if you're standing in China today, you're pretty much looking like the center of the world,
Sure, yeah. But I mean, I'm talking about these desert trade routes.
The desert trade routes, are interesting. I mean, I think they were always isolated to a point, but they had these key nodes along the way that were these thriving towns and cities, and Donghuang Caves is another famous one.
I'm thinking of the Donghuang Caves. When you go there, it just seems it's in the middle of the desert, and you just wonder what it would have been like back in the
it's an oasis town, right? So that's why it's there. But actually, at that period, the capital of Tang China is in Xi'an or Chang'an, so it's pretty close. I mean, it moves to. I think Beijing is only in the sort of 17th century. Before that it moves down to Nanjing. So again, in that period, even the heart of the Chinese of the Chinese Empire, the Tang period, is in that upper north western area of China.
Yeah.
And again, it's there because it's the end point of the overland Silk Road. So all of this movement to and fro is definitely. Creating these very rich, cosmopolitan, and large-scale cities. We know, I think, at that period, it's sort of Tang China, it's Baghdad in the Abbasid Empire, and later on you get places like Angkor Wat becoming one of the largest urban areas in the world. But definitely at that period, these are the key sort of mega cities of their day. So
I've been to Dongguan, and when you walk into those caves, it's basically just a huge work. I mean, from what I could see, it's just this huge work of Buddhist art. It's absolutely phenomenal.
They're spectacular. And again, I mean, part of it's the climatic the climate of the region, because it's so dry there, they survive. And it's one of the few places where you can really examine that type of Buddhist mural painting in such detail. We know in the Ajanta caves in India, there's some of it there as well. So it does survive there to a certain extent, but not to the same level as Donghuang. We know in Southeast Asia would definitely have been these traditions as well, but because it's so humid, the earliest mural paintings we have there are 14th century. Most of them date to sort of 17th to 18th century. So yeah, Donghuang is key because it gives us this point in time where we can.
And if I compare it again to European art, some of the greatest European art was sort of this Baroque, high Baroque, counter-Reformation art, which was basically propaganda for the Catholic Church, for the Vatican, that they paid huge sums for. And artists flocked to Rome and painted these incredible pieces. But if we go to Buddhist art, you're saying that this art was much more devotional. Do you think there was an element of propaganda?
Yeah, I mean, there is as well. I mean, patronage is the key term. Like, I think every art, every great sort of moment of flourishing of art or architecture needs substantial patronage. And that's particularly the case with Buddhism as well, because actually Buddhist monks cannot own any property. They're not even meant to handle money. So they're always completely reliant on the society around them to donate everything. So whether that's a donation to build a monastery or a donation of food, so the alms rounds every morning, the donation of the robes is a very important ceremony. So again, if you want something, I mean, so there's two things happening. There's that donation and large scale patronage where you'll get these sort of mega monuments. But I think somewhere like Donghuang as well, it is this oasis town, and it's a bit like Ajanta as well. Those part of the Buddhist tradition is to withdraw from society and meditate and study. So I think what's happening there as well is that the monks themselves are the ones doing the painting. So it's a sort of devotional, I guess it's similar to the monastic traditions in the early medieval period in Europe, where it's the scribes that are making the manuscripts, right? And they repeatedly copy them. And so you get a similar tradition in Buddhism where the monks are actually replicating the artwork over and over and over again.
So it was sort of part of the life for the monk to have art within their life, to paint and
paint. And maybe, like anything, some monks are going to be better at it than others. So maybe the ones that have an artistic leaning do the painting. The others that are better at chanting will lead the chanting of the sutras, the texts. They also have to, again, like the Western medieval tradition, everything in the Buddhist world was written on usually palm leaf manuscript. And so again, they would have to constantly recopy and reinscribe these manuscripts. So that was part of it as well.
And so there's this 200, 300 year period from the inception of the philosophy, the religion of Buddhism, to the first image of the Buddha. So what do you think was happening? I mean, I think that happened within the Christian world. There was the sort of symbol of the shell, and there was a symbol of the fish for Jesus Christ until, basically he was copied by the Greeks for the god of Apollo. The Apollo was copied as the symbol of Jesus Christ. But do you think a similar thing was happening within Buddhist art, or why was this lag happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's just hard to. I mean, okay, so there's one thing that does happen that helps explain it. In the beginning, like most religions, Buddhism is just it develops from the teachings of the Buddha, and it's very lineage based. So the teachings get handed down from one monk to the next, and that's how you learn. And obviously we're not quite sure when the texts start to get written down, but definitely quite early on. And at first, the Buddhist teaching is quite it's quite a steep entry point if you want to really achieve what the Buddha says, because essentially the idea is that you have to accumulate enough merit, which is good karma. So if you do good deeds, you build up good karma. And then in each subsequent rebirth, you build up more and more good karma. And eventually, if you do that for long enough, then you'll reach Buddhahood. So the Buddha was reincarnated 547 times before he reached enlightenment.
That's a big ask.
So that's a big ask, right? And most people are like, oh, I don't think I have that, amount of time or dedication. And even within your own lifetime, to gain that good karma, you would have to renounce everything, become a monk, live a life of meditation. This is where there's a sort of paradox in Buddhism, because if everybody did that, then there'd be nobody left to support the Buddhist monks.
So whenever you're traveling in India or in Thailand and you see these Buddhist monks, do you think, how far down the path are you?
You could ask, right?
I mean, how many times have you been?
So there is a belief that so the Buddha, once he reached enlightenment, one of the things that happened was then he could instantly remember all of his past lives. But so anyway, that's too difficult for most of us. So a different form of Buddhism emerges called Mahayana. And that's the form that's prevalent in China, Japan, Korea today. And in Mahayana Buddhism, what they say is that actually everybody has Buddha nature within them, and that you just need to unlock it. And if you can unlock it, you can be enlightened pretty quickly. The other thing they do is that I think human nature needs somebody to worship or pray to or beseech. And as I said at the start, that's not what the Buddha cannot help you with that, because he doesn't exist anymore. He's reached cessation of being. So they developed this concept of bodhisattvas, which are enlightened beings so they've reached enlightenment, but they've held off on entering nirvana. So they're still within our cosmos or within our universe. And you can pray to a bodhisattva and they can help you. So there's famous ones. One is called Avalokiteshvara, which in the Chinese tradition is called Guan Yin, which is a very famous one. In Japan, it's called Kannon. And you can pray to this god. Essentially, it's a sort of a deity. And they will help you in this world. And so that necessitates a sculptural tradition. So part of what is the stimulus for this sculptural tradition is not to depict the Buddha per se, but to start depicting these other range of deities called bodhisattvas. Yeah. Right. And so that, we think, is one of the catalysts for this this sculptural tradition of Buddhism. And it makes it much richer as well, because the bodhisattvas, they usually have 4 arms or 8 arms to show their supernatural power. They're actually bedecked in jewelry. So that's the big difference. If you see them, they're sometimes described as celestial beings. So if you see them, then you're like, okay, that's a bodhisattva.
Oh, I see. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I can pray to that. And sometimes they have multiple arms, so they can help people in all the different corners of the universe.
So they're sort of helpers, teachers of
believers
exactly.
in Buddhism. Yeah, and there's different ones. There's one called Manjusri, who's the bodhisattva of wisdom. So that's about teaching. And so that sort of explodes and then moves into China and Japan and really, in the Tang period.
And so what year is this that it explodes?
It develops in about the 2nd, 3rd century CE, reaches China in the 5th century, and by the Tang period in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, it's the dominant religion in Tang China, and this is where you really start to see.
And of course, Tang China was a very wealthy dynasty in China, and where money always creates
money
great
and power,
art.
And there's actually quite a lot of tension develops between the indigenous religions, which are Confucianism and Taoism, and Buddhism. And Buddhism, and you see this in Japan as well, it starts to get a bit too successful, then there's a bit of a pushback.
Oh, from the Taoist monks?
Yeah, from the Taoists to the Confucianists. In Japan, it's always a sort of swinging pendulum between Buddhism and Shintoism. And Shintoism is the indigenous Japanese religion, which is essentially nature worship.
And were there any wars of religion?
There are. I mean, in Japan, and it's not my area per se, but I do know, I think it's in the it's in the shogunate period, in maybe the 15th, 16th century, the Buddhist monks get too powerful, and there is a massacre by one of the claimants to become like the shogun, one of the shogunates. So yeah, you do see it in Japan where it can get quite.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's in China you never see, as far as I tell you never see that. It's just a sort of maneuvering of power. If they get sort of too powerful in the court, then sometimes there's a bit of a check put on them. But
I was reading about Genghis Khan the other day, and he invited a Muslim, a Christian monk, and also a Buddhist monk to convince them in a sort of dinner ceremony, to convince him which one was the greater religion, and he always chose his like indigenous religion, which was believing in the sky god and things like that. But it's interesting just to think back in those days that he was trying to understand world religions. So we're sort of understanding the spread into China, and your area of expertise is really into Thailand. So if we're thinking that Buddhism moved from northern India into Thailand, how did it first sort of spread? Was it by land? Was it by sea? How did it spread into Southeast Asia?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. You can get overland through. So actually, by the time it moves into Southeast Asia, which is about the 5th, 6th century CE, you have these major Buddhist centers in Sri Lanka, southern India, but particularly in the area around what is today Bihar province in northern India, and Bangladesh actually. And so you have this big Buddhist university called Nalanda. So actually you can go overland through Bangladesh down into what is today Burma or Myanmar, and then from there into Thailand. So that's the overland route.
And do you think it predominantly spread overland, or do you think that there was a lot?
No, I think it's both. So by the 5th century CE, we already have a lot of, actually even earlier, we have a lot of evidence for maritime trade, or not even just trade, just sort of maritime travel. Actually, we have a 4th century Chinese monk who leaves China. I think he goes overland to India, called Faxian. So he goes overland on the overland Silk Road to get to India, and then on the way back he takes the sea route and he goes down to Sri Lanka, and then he gets a boat across. They end up in a storm, they get lost in Java somewhere, which is modern day Indonesia, and then they finally make it back up to Guangzhou. So we have accounts of that. We have another Chinese monk called Yi Jing who in about 670 CE, again he takes the sea route from Guangzhou all the way down to Srivijaya, which is this Buddhist culture in what is today modern day Sumatra in Indonesia. He stays there for about 6 months. Then he gets a ship up to an Indian port called Tamlaripti, which is near modern day Calcutta. So yeah, we have
They're traveling vast distances, aren't they?
And we have shipwreck evidence as well from the 8th, 9th century to show that there's substantial shipping taking place between, actually at that point, by the 9th century, we know they're traveling all the way from Tang China all the way to the Abbasid Empire, which is Iran, Iraq. So large scale shipping at that point.
But the spread of Buddhism into China sort of happened slightly earlier than Southeast Asia, did it?
Slightly earlier because it's overland, it comes in over those overland routes. It's hard with Southeast Asia. Actually, Myanmar, we know now, actually, by the 3rd, 4th century, you're getting Buddhism. By the 5th century, it's definitely really established. So that is coeval, at about the same time as China. Again, it's really that 7th, 8th, 9th century period where things start to flourish, and you get these early historic kingdoms within Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar.
Do you think that was the influence of Tang China? Because obviously it's the big powerhouse of the region. Not
particularly, no. It's not. There's not much of a. There is connection, but it's not pushing Buddhism at that point.
So it's sort of independently spreading and evolving in Southeast Asia.
In Southeast Asia.
And so can you see the big differences in art? Are
there quite clearly. So again, what's interesting is that when it moves into China, quite quickly the Buddha images start to take on Chinese characteristics. The robe that the Buddha is wearing is, again, based on clothing that the Chinese would be wearing themselves. When it moves into, say, Thailand, for example, at that period, the Thai people that we know today are not in that region at that point in time. They migrate in by about the 11th century, but there's a ethnic group called the Mon, which are today still in the lower half of Myanmar. And so you start to see them, the Buddha images take on their sort of facial characteristics. When it moves into Cambodia, you quickly see them becoming quite Khmer. So yeah, you can tell quite, in a lot of, sometimes in the earliest periods, so for example, the Buddha images you're getting in Thailand in the 6th century and the Buddha images you're getting in the Mekong Delta look identical. So if you don't know the fine spot, you may struggle to say which it is, but you can say, okay, it's either central Thailand or sort of Mekong.
It's like
Delta.
looking at sort of ancient Greek sculpture or ancient Roman sculpture. It's pretty similar.
It's pretty similar. But by about the 9th, 10th century, it starts to get very localized. So by that point, you'll know, okay, this is definitely from central Thailand, or this is from northeast Thailand, that's from Burma, that's from Cambodia. Yeah, so by that point, it gets quite codified, and in a way, from a artistic point of view, the more interesting period is that early period where it's not so codified, and there's much more. It seems to be much more flexibility in terms of how you can depict the Buddha or even Hindu images as well. Once it gets to sort of 11th, 12th century, it gets very codified and very uniform, and so it sort of loses its dynamism to a certain extent.
That's
I mean, it's still sort of beautiful sculpture to look at, but it's one of those interesting phenomenon that you get with Buddhist art. And yeah, maybe sort of one point I wanted to raise is that, you know, one way of understanding Buddhist art as well is that, and maybe the art we're seeing is that sometimes with our very modern or contemporary Western mindset, we think that every piece of art has to be original, right? It has to be something new, and that's the artistic genius. But in the Buddhist tradition, it's the opposite. You're meant to replicate what went before, and you're meant to try and replicate it as close as possible, because the making of a Buddha image also bestows merit onto the maker and the patron. And so you're sort of respecting the tradition. And this is why you'll see sort of reproduction of the same type of Buddha image on mass scale. And so that's a good thing. And so, but
that's really interesting, because
so it sort of takes a change of mindset to understand it.
Very different change of mindset. I mean, in European art, you have this idea of these sort of individual geniuses that come in, like Michelangelo, Caravaggio, Leonardo, that are sort of these celebrated artists that have this unique vision, and that sort of no one can sort of touch their genius kind of thing. But you're saying in Asia that wasn't so much the case.
I mean, I'm sure. So of course I mean, even with, say, Leonardo da Vinci, right? He's still working within a framework, right? He can't go too far outside it, right? He has to depict Christ in a certain way, right? There's certain parameters or certain symbols that you have to depict.
I guess the question that I would
so it's how do you work within that? Right?
Do you have these celebrity artists or celebrated artists in art history in Thailand or in China?
No, and that's the difference. And the idea of naming yourself as an artist as well is a very, I think, Eurocentric tradition, right? That the artist takes the credit. So in the Buddhist tradition, it's an act of merit, right? It's so it's a selfless act in that sense. So we don't get artists named. You get the donors, the patrons will be named.
Right.
So it'll say something like, so-and-so donated this Buddha image in honor of his late mother in order to gain merit. you'll get these very formulaic sentences, but it'll never mention the artist. So
That's
again,
really interesting.
the idea of, but we know they're there, and we know that, again, that some of them are obviously these creative geniuses, because some of the artworks that we get are just magnificent.
Oh, yeah.
And so they're working within the same box, right, or the same frame as other artists, but they can take that and elevate it to something that's just spectacular and sort of jaw-dropping, no matter who looks at it at any time, any place.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
it's like
yeah,
medieval like Buddhist sculpture is just absolutely astoundingly beautiful, well made, well designed, out of this world, and you think, who's behind this?
Yeah, but so you'll never know. Like the odd time with like manuscript painting, you might get like a name, might be the scribe who did it. But yeah, we don't have, and so it makes for a very different art history as well, right? Even the study of Buddhist art or Buddhist iconography, you're not going to develop these ideas. Well, I mean, you can, and scholars sometimes have tried to, sort of the idea of schools or ateliers and workshops. You can identify workshops. I mean, you can see, okay, here's a workshop, and they're producing a particular style of Buddha image.
And would they always be attached to the Buddhist monastery?
And they'd be attached to a monastery or a specific city or town. But again, we have no record of, like, you know, here's Da Vinci or Michelangelo, and he's the one making the kind of image, and then are getting all of his students to do all the legwork. I mean, I'm sure that type of thing is happening as well, but we don't have that clear record of it. Definitely in the Southeast Asian school. It might be a bit different in Japan and China. In the sort of,
you hear of famous poets.
Yeah, like I think in China, what you get is you do get all these from actually the Song period, so that's 12th century onwards. I mean, they're stamping literally they're putting a seal on their paintings. But this is not Buddhist art. This is Chinese landscape painting.
Yeah.
And so they have a very clear tradition of, and they're usually literati. So they do poetry, they're government officials, they paint. So that's a different tradition that that's sort of definitely out of my wheelhouse. But it's interesting that there you have named artists, and actually you get, what's an interesting thing with that is you get the artist, and then sometimes after the artwork changes hands, the next person will then put their seal on it as well, and sometimes add a little bit to the poem. So sometimes you get these paintings that have been handed down through maybe 500 years with about 15 or 20 seals on them, and you can trace like the ownership of who's had it. And so that's another fascinating topic that you would need to talk to a Chinese art specialist on. But I think in China and in Japan, you probably have a more systemized sort of school of artists that are working within that type of cultural milieu. But in the Buddhist world, not so much in the Southeast Asian context.
And do we get Buddhist art penetrating into Europe and going west into sort of the Middle East and Europe as well? Or did it sort of stay? So what was blocking it?
Yeah, I mean, up until recently, I would have said not so much. But about 4 years ago, there's a site called Berenike, and it's in Egypt. It's at the top of the Red Sea, and it was a Roman. I think it was a Greek. It's definitely a Roman seaport, and it was the main port for the Romans to get into the Gulf. And there's been excavations going on there for a long time, but about 4 years ago, they discovered a Buddha image, which was, and what's even more remarkable is that when they analyzed the stone, it's local stone. So this Buddha image was, I know, so this is kind of mind-blowing, and has totally just sort of rewritten the playbook. And it's second century.
Second century.
Like, this is super early.
Very, very early.
Yeah.
And it's local stone from this region in the Red Sea.
And it's and there's also Hindu sculpture there from about the 5th century as well. So
What are the ideas behind that? Why does anyone know why that's
it's
happening?
such a new discovery that there's no academic literature has been published on it yet, as far as I know. There's a good write-up in the Smithsonian magazine. But yeah, it's
Wow.
It's quite amazing.
So that's really rocked the sort of art history world.
But that's sort of one of the only incidences we have. And it doesn't spread further than, sort of Central Asia, Afghanistan, into Pakistan.
You don't get Roman legions coming over and bringing the Buddhist symbol back into Rome and things like that.
There is sort of, by the sort of 11th, 12th century, there's sort of certain ideas of Buddhism sort of percolating in, but no, you don't get it. So yeah, it's an interesting question as to why things sort of stop at a certain point. Probably, I don't know. But yeah, it's there. It's there on the seaports.
And you worked on an excavation in Indonesia. That was something you worked on a few years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found? What were some of the artifacts that you found there?
So I wasn't involved in the excavation itself. There was a shipwreck that was discovered in 1998 off the coast of Belitung Island in Indonesia. But I worked as a curator in the Asian Civilisations Museum, Singapore, where the collection ended up. And that was really significant because we know from the ship technology that it's most likely a Middle Eastern ship. So this type of ship where they sew it together. There's no nails or dowels. But
which area was that ship from?
So it's hard to pinpoint it exactly, but we know Oman is a strong candidate. They still have this tradition. Also see it in Gujarat, which is the northwest coast of India. It also exists in Kerala, which is the southwest. So there's a few sort of areas. What's interesting now is there was another shipwreck found in 2014 in Thailand, just outside of Bangkok. Same type of technology. And when they analyze the wood, it's all Southeast Asian materials. So this is again raising questions as to whether we know the ship technology is Middle Eastern. So did they repair the ship there, or did the ship technology move into Southeast Asia and Southeast Asians start to adapt it? But so that's interesting in and of itself. But what's also interesting is the cargo. The cargo was about 60,000 Chinese ceramics. So again, this shows that we have trade and communication on a sort of large scale from Tang China into Indonesia and then onwards onto the Middle East. But
so what year was this ship traveling
about
when it sank?
830, 840 CE is what we think.
And the majority of its cargo was Chinese ceramics. Porcelain. And
at this point, it's technically what we call stoneware. Porcelain comes into existence about 150 years later. And
that was very prized in which area of the world? India or Middle East? Or?
The Middle East it's very prized. So whitewares, the Chinese whiteware is very heavily prized in the Abbasid court in Baghdad. So you have whitewares, you have these greenwares as well, or celadons. But they're the minority of the cargo because this is really high-end material. The majority of these bowls come from a kiln site in central China called Changsha. And they're still valuable, but they're not sort of really high end.
Right. So they're probably for the mass market.
They're for the mass market, and you see them turning up in Southeast Asia at archaeological sites. You see them they get as far as Okinawa and Kyushu in Japan.
Why were they going so far to just get these very...
Chinese were just the best at making ceramics. It's globalization in the 9th century.
Nothing's changed. They still make everything.
So we don't know what the tariffs were, but obviously not as high as they are right now. But I talked to an archaeologist recently who's excavating in a site in Samara, which is in southern Oman. And he said it's everywhere. He was just like, this Changsha ware is everywhere we dig. So, yeah.
Right. Wow, that's incredible to know about. And were there any like very high end works of art on the boat as well?
Yeah, there was some gold on it, a gold cup, some gold plates. There was a very large scale ewer that's very highly prized. And then interesting, on some of the bowls, there's some Buddhist motifs.
Right.
So there's one with a Buddhist stupa. So again, it's kind of interesting that these motifs are traveling into what is at that point the Abbasid Empire, which is or the Abbasid Caliphate, which is an Islamic caliphate. So whether they would have understood what these symbols were or not is interesting.
Yeah.
There's a mirror on it, which is a Taoist mirror. So again, with Chinese inscriptions on it. So you have this material moving that was probably seen as sort of luxury and exotic.
And there was 60,000 pieces of ceramic.
Yeah.
So that's only a boat that's sunk and that's been found later. You imagine all the thousands and thousands of ships that were going back and forth at that time.
Probably wasn't thousands. There's probably, we know from Arab sources that they would send a fleet once a year.
Okay, so not that. Not
5 to 10 maybe.
Right.
Yeah, and the Chinese were very good at, speaking of tariffs, the Chinese had set up a customs office at Guangzhou, which is, just north of modern day Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And so you had to dock there and pay your port fees. And so they kept very detailed records.
Okay.
So we have records of ships that are coming in. So again, it's looking sort of like 3 or 4 ships a year at most. But they are, I mean, for that time and that period, and if they're all carrying 60, 70, 80,000 ceramics, I mean, they'll flood the market when they get back. So that's probably the capacity of the markets at that point. I mean, it increases over time by the Sung period. So we have a 10th century shipwreck that's got over 200,000 ceramics on it. So
incredible.
Yeah, so it's mass exportation. It's mass production as well. Like they have these what they call dragon kilns in China that can fire up to something like 30 or 40,000 ceramics at a time. So it's and you even have Chinese.
Still today, there's still the biggest factories in the world in China.
And they talk about these sites are just like these kind of hellscapes of just, air pollution, and all the trees are being cut down to fuel the flames of the kilns. There's just kind of ashes. So it's nothing new.
No, it's been the factory of the world for millennia.
So so it's quite pertinent.
And what's your favorite Buddhist artwork in the world, would you say?
I always hate when people ask that question.
It's always interesting for the listeners.
Yeah, it's really difficult. It's really, really difficult.
I mean, I'm thinking of Angkor Wat when I went there. It's not so much an artwork. It's
there's the architecture,
but it's just mind blowing.
It's spectacular.
It's just on any level in the world. It's one of the greatest sort of places in the world. When I went there, I was just absolutely blown away. The whole thing is just like this intricate work of art. The first thing you think is, who the hell made this?
Yeah, exactly.
This is insane.
I mean, Angkor is remarkable.
But there are lots of cities not lots of cities, but are there other cities like that? Or was that just unique to Angkor Wat?
Pretty unique in terms of the scale of Angkor. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. So you start to get the Khmer civilization, again, developing by the 7th, actually earlier. I mean, we have Chinese texts from the 3rd century talking about the Khmers already. By the 6th, 7th century, they're starting to produce Buddha images, Hindu images. Angkor, the city itself, is founded in the 9th century. Angkor Wat is 12th century, so you have, leading up to that, you have 300 years of temple building. So I'm sure if you go to the site, you see that there's hundreds of different temples, and they all date from different periods. So you see this steady sort of evolution of the temple pyramid or temple mountain over time, and Angkor is the sort of apex of that architectural tradition in the 12th or 11th, 12th century.
The artistry in
the artistry is just
out
remarkable.
Of this world. It really is mind blowing.
Yeah, and so that is what's interesting, is that's a Hindu monument. So the Khmers were primarily, they were Buddhist that time, but primarily they worshipped Hindu religion, so mainly the god Shiva. But Angkor Wat is interesting because it's dedicated to Vishnu. But by the 16th century, it becomes Buddhist. So
right.
And
were they intermixing the religions, or was it this period was Buddhist? This period,
yeah, at the time when they're building it was clearly Hindu.
Right.
And it's again they're similar to the pharaohs. Angkor Wat is thought to be a mausoleum to Suryavarman II, who is the king who built it. But because they're Hindu temples, the Hindu temple concept is that you build a temple which is the abode of the god, and then very different to Buddhism is that then when you create an image of the Hindu god, so if it's Vishnu, for example, you place that in the center of the temple, and the god will actually inhabit the sculpture. So he may not inhabit it all the time, but you can perform a ceremony, and that will invite the god to enter the sculpture. And if the
worshippers feel his presence almost.
And if the sculpture is perfectly formed, he will enter it. So it's a very different concept to that of the Buddha, whereas the Buddha is more just a symbol of these teachings and practice. The Hindu image has an innate, like literally is the embodiment, or the god is embodied within it. So the Khmer's stay Hindu. They kind of shift back and forth. Sometimes, again, Buddhism becomes ascendant at certain points, but they're primarily Hindu. But then by the 15th, 16th century, they convert to Buddhism at that point. And what's interesting then is you get Angkor Wat at that point. The capital shifts at that point down to near where Phnom Penh is today. But Angkor Wat, there's still a Buddhist presence there. So there's Buddhist monks and a Buddhist monastery. And so if people go back there today, sometimes you'll still see the Buddhist monks there. So it gets repurposed as a Buddhist shrine at one point as well. So you do see that shifting back and forth of the religions.
But back to our question, what's your favorite
piece
of Buddhist art in the world?
It's a bit obscure, but there's a piece that's it's in the Musée Guimet in Paris today, the Guimet Museum. It's a 7th to 8th century bodhisattva that was found in the 1930s in southern Vietnam in the Mekong Delta, and it's
where was it found?
It was found in a place called Rakia, which is hard to find today, but it's quite close to, let me think. You could get there from Saigon. You could then sort of go across, but it's very close to the Cambodian-Vietnamese border today. And they found it, I think, when they were dredging a canal or something. But it's just a beautiful early, one of the earliest expressions of a Southeast Asian bodhisattva. And its face is so calm and peaceful. It's not elaborately adorned. It's very simple and naturalistic. And I think it just sort of speaks to me as this perfect embodiment of that Buddhist.
You like the simplicity?
The simplicity and the expression on the face, I think, just embodies the kind of Buddhist ideals. So it's a really, really beautiful piece.
And is there an image of the Buddha that is considered the first image ever made of the Buddha?
No, there's no. Okay, there's a myth. There's a legend that the first image was made out of sandalwood and gifted to a king. But no, there's no like one object or one image that we can say this is the first Buddha image.
But would that image, one of the Buddha image that you were talking about that was found at the Red Sea with the old Roman...
It's one of the earliest we know.
Do you think that would be one of the earliest?
It is one of the earliest.
Yeah.
And then the ones in Gandhara are... So it's
mind-blowing.
It's contemporary with what's happening in Gandhara. This early Buddhist Hellenistic kind of fusion of styles. And so maybe it's...
To you, what you're saying, Alexander the Great had quite an influence on Buddhist art.
Yeah, I don't want to credit them too much because there is in the sort of 19th and early 20th century, when European scholars were first looking at this art, I think they overplayed the hand of the Europeans and sort of, oh look, it's like the Europeans did everything right.
As the Europeans always do.
We even gave them Buddhist art, which is not the case. I think you already have iconographic traditions and sculptural traditions within India, but there is definitely a like this fusion or hybridity where they're taking these Hellenistic ideals and ideas and making them their own. So yeah, that's definitely there. But yeah, we can't pinpoint like the first Buddha image. So
no, too complex a history.
Lost
Listen,
in
you've
time.
given us the most amazing overview of Buddhist art in these different regions and an idea of the history, the complex history, and it's just fascinating. And hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Sure, we can have a round too.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Great.